BBC Sport is a department of the BBC North Division providing national sports coverage for BBC television, radio and online. The BBC holds the television and radio UK broadcasting rights to several sports, broadcasting the sport live or alongside flagship analysis programmes such as Match of the Day, Test Match Special, Ski Sunday, Today at Wimbledon and previously Grandstand. Results, analysis and coverage is also added to the BBC Sport website and through the BBC Red Button interactive television service. History. The BBC has broadcast sport for several decades under individual programme names and coverage titles. Grandstand was one of the more notable sport programmes, broadcasting sport since the programme's launch in 1958. The BBC first began to brand sport coverage as BBC Sport in 1988 for the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul, by introducing the programme with a short animation of a globe circumnavigated by four coloured rings. This practice continued throughout the next 2 decades. Upon the launch of the BBC News website in 1997, sport was included in the BBC's online presence for the first time. In May 2007, the BBC Trust approved plans for several BBC departments, including BBC Sport, to be moved to a new development in Salford. The new development at Media City UK marks a major decentralisation of BBC departments from London and a key investment in the north of England where BBC spending in the region had previously been low. The department moved into Key House, Media City UK gradually in late 2011 and early 2012, with the first sports bulletins being broadcast from the new BBC Sports Centre on the 5th of March 2012. Summary of sports programming. Football. The BBC shares the rights to the FIFA World Cup with ITV. A near-equal split of group stage and knockout stage games are shown, including a semi-final, and the final is shown on both networks. The BBC shows highlights of the Premier League on Match of the Day, which has been hosted by Gary Lineker since 1999. Match of the Day 2 and Match of the Day 2 Extra are presented by Mark Chapman. Dan Walker hosts Football Focus every Saturday lunchtime before Jason Mohammed presents Final Score every Saturday afternoon. Pundits for Match of the Day include Alan Shearer, Danny Murphy, Jermaine Genus, Martin Keown and Ian Wright, while commentators include Guy Mowbray, Steve Wilson, Jonathan Pearce, Simon Brotherton, Steve Bauer, John Mutsin and Alistair Mann. The BBC also broadcasts live coverage of the FA Cup and will do so until 2018. Tennis. BBC Sport currently holds the rights to broadcast the Wimbledon Tennis Championships and the Queen's Club Championships live on its television platforms. The Wimbledon contract has been held by the BBC since 1937 and the current contract lasts until 2017, making it the longest such contract in the world. The BBC produce over 900 hours of footage that is distributed to broadcasters in 159 different countries. BBC Wimbledon coverage is presented by former British number 1 and 1976 French Open champion Sue Barker. Matches are broadcast live on BBC One, BBC Two, the Red Button, or online via the BBC Sport website. Highlights are also shown on the long-running Today at Wimbledon, presented by Claire Balding, who replaced John Inverdale in 2015. The same year, the programme was renamed Wimbledon Today, with a new light-hearted magazine format, but after only 1 year, the format has been abandoned for 2016. Commentators include Barry Davies, John McEnroe, Boris Becker, John Lloyd, Andy Roddick, Martina Navratilova, David Mercer, Nick Mullins, Jonathan Overend, Anne Keothavong, Virginia Wade, Wade, Sam Smith, Tracy Austin, Tim Henman, Andrew Castle, Lindsay Davenport, Pat Gash, John Inverdale, Chris Bradnam, Jamie Baker, Dan Lobb, Guy McRae, Mark Petchley, Simon Reed, Matt Chilton, Peter Fleming, Elizabeth Smiley, Joe Jury, Louise Fleming, Andrew Cotter, Ronald McIntosh and Alison Mitchell. Regular tournament weather updates are provided by Carol Kirkwood. The BBC also broadcasts two traditional grass warm-up events in the fortnight before the Wimbledon Championships. First is the Aegon Championships from Queen's Club, which takes place 2 weeks before Wimbledon. Coverage is led by Sue Barker with commentary by Andrew Castle, Andrew Cotter, John Lloyd and Amp Peter Fleming. The following week is the WTA Aegon International event from Eastbourne. In 2015, coverage was introduced by John Inverdale and Lee Mackenzie with commentary from Andrew Cotter, Sam Smith, Chris Bradnam and Amp Annabel Croft. Both events are primarily shown on BBC Two. The BBC also shares broadcasting coverage of the ATP World Tour Finals with Sky Sports, showing one afternoon match per day including one semi-final and the final, which are usually shown on BBC Two. The BBC has a joint deal with Eurosport to show all of Britain's Davis Cup matches for 3 years to 2017, with coverage predominantly broadcast on BBC Two and the Red Button. Rugby Union. The BBC holds joint rights to the Six Nations Championship in the UK with ITV Sport until 2021. The BBC will show all France, Scotland and Wales home matches live either on BBC One or BBC Two. Coverage of these games is complemented by an interactive service on BBC Red Button and radio commentary on all matches. The BBC hold the live rights to the autumn internationals for the Scottish and Welsh sides as well as highlights of the English team. John Inverdale leads the BBC's rugby coverage. Gabby Logan and Jason Mohammed also present some of the rugby coverage. Jeremy Guscott, Jonathan Davies, Keith Wood, Andy Nichol, Martin Williams and Chris Pattison of the main pundits. The BBC's main commentators are Eddie Butler and Andrew Cotter, who commentate alongside Brian Moore and Philip Matthews. Occasionally some of the pundits may fill in as co-commentator. Rugby League. The BBC shows live coverage of the Challenge Cup including both semi-finals and the final, the Four Nations and the Rugby League World Cup. Coverage is hosted by Mark Chapman and Tanya Arnold with commentary from Dave Woods, Jonathan Davies and Brian Noble. The BBC's Super League show shows weekly highlights of the Super League Magic Weekend, Super 8s and the Grand Final. Olympics. The BBC holds the exclusive terrestrial rights to show Summer Olympic Games and Winter Olympic Games and has shown live coverage of every Summer Olympics since 1960. For the 2012 Olympics in London, the BBC had 3 stations showing live coverage of the Games. BBC One showed main coverage, BBC Three with special extended coverage and BBC Two were broadcast coverage when BBC One was broadcasting news bulletins. The BBC's current rights deal lasts through the 2020 Summer Olympics. Beginning at the 2018 Winter Olympics, the BBC will enter into sub-licensing agreements with Discovery Communications, the pan-European rights holder of the Olympics for 2018 through 2024. Discovery will sub-license exclusive pay television rights to the Games from the BBC in 2018 and 2020, and will then, in turn, sub-license terrestrial rights to the Games to the BBC in 2022 and 2024. The deal is intended to maintain the BBC's tradition of Olympic broadcasting. Although the BBC's coverage will be reduced as a result, the BBC and Discovery have had a historic relationship in regards to co-production of factual and nature programming. Commonwealth Games. The BBC showed the 2014 Commonwealth Games with more coverage than ever before. Coverage was similar to the coverage of the 2012 London Olympics. Live coverage was shown from 9 AM to 10:30 PM on BBC One, with coverage switching to BBC Two during news bulletins. BBC Three broadcast alternative coverage from 9 AM to 10 PM. Athletics. The BBC covers events such as the Commonwealth Games, the European Athletics Championships, domestic British athletics and mass participation events such as the London Marathon and the Great North Run. The BBC have the rights to show coverage of each Diamond League meeting on the red button, with the two British rounds and final two meetings live on BBC Two and selected meetings on BBC Three. In July 2013, the BBC announced that they had extended their deal to broadcast British athletic events such as the British Championships, World and European Championship trials and the upcoming anniversary games through to 2020. The BBC lost the rights to the 2011 and 2013 World Championships to Channel 4. However, in November 2011 it was announced that the BBC has obtained the TV, radio and online rights to the 2015 and 2017 IAAF World Athletics events. It was also announced Channel 4 decided to hand the rights to the 2013 championships to the BBC. This was down to Channel 4 saying they wanted to focus on Paralympic sports. The BBC Athletics presenting team consists of Gabby Logan, Colin Jackson, Steve Cram, Jonathan Edwards, Denise Lewis, Paul Dickinson, Brendan Foster, Andrew Cotter, Michael Johnson, Paula Radcliffe and Steve Backley. Golf. The BBC holds joint rights to live coverage of one of the four men's major golf championships, the US Masters, covering Saturday and Sunday's play live and broadcasting highlights of Thursday and Friday's play. Sky Sports shows all 4 days of the Masters live. Until 2015, the BBC's coverage of the Open Championships was extensive, with coverage broadcast live and uninterrupted on BBC Two between 9 AM and 8 PM on Thursday and Friday, and on BBC One on Saturday and Sunday. From 2016, Sky Sports will have exclusive UK rights to the Open, with the BBC showing a 2-hour highlights programme every night instead of live coverage. The BBC also shows highlights of 2 other European Tour events held in Britain, the BMW PGA Championship and the Scottish Open. It also covers the Women's British Open. Hazel Irvine is the lead presenter, with commentary from Peter Ellis, Ken Brown, Andrew Cotter, Paul Azinger, Maureen Maddell and Wayne Grady. Rishi Persad is the reporter. Snooker. The 1960s BBC Two programme Pot Black was arguably the reason for the sport's great popularity over the last 40 years. Snooker produced the largest ever audience for BBC Two, with the 1985 World Snooker Championship final between Steve Davis and Dennis Taylor pulling in 18.5 million viewers just after midnight, and the sport always pulls in large viewing figures for the BBC. The BBC currently shows the World Snooker Championships, the Masters and the UK Championship on BBC Two. The BBC also broadcasts the Welsh Open, and this is shown on the BBC Red Button and on BBC Two Wales. The coverage is regularly hosted by Hazel Irvine and Jason Mohammed, and the pundits are often Steve Davis and John Parrott. The commentary team mainly consists of former champions of the sport, such as Ken Doherty, Dennis Taylor, John Virgo and Stephen Hendry. Other commentators are used for a longer tour tournaments such as Willie Thorne and Terry Griffiths. During the World Championships, guest commentators have featured, such as Peter Ebdon and George Riley, though Riley has only appeared as a commentator on an occasional basis. For the Welsh Open, Jason Mohammed and Rob Walker host with Darren Morgan as pundit for important games. Terry Griffiths, Willie Thorne, Dominic Dale and Darren Morgan are commentators. Darts. In February 2016, it was announced that the BBC would cover the inaugural Champions League of Darts. As a consequence, the BBC will no longer show the BDO World Darts Championships, a tournament that the BBC had shown this since its inception in 1978. Darts presenters on the BBC have included David Vine in 1978, Peter Purvis from 1979 to 1984, Tony Gubber from 1985 to 1990, Eamon Holmes from 1991 to 1993, Dougie Donnelly from 1994 to 1998, John Inverdale from 1999-2000, Ray Stubbs from 2001 to 2009, and Colin Murray and AMP Rob Walker from 2010-present. Bobby George has presented as well from 2000-present. The current commentators are Tony Green 1978 to 2010 and 2012-present, Vassos Alexander 2011-present and Jim Proudfoot 2013-present, Scott Mitchell 2014-present and John Rawling 2014-present. Former commentators are Sid Waddell 1978 to 1994, David Croft 2003 to 2012 and John Part 1995 to 2007. American football. On the 9th of September 2015, the BBC announced that the NFL would return to its screens in a 2-year deal that includes the rights to show the NFL International Series games from London Live, with the first match being exclusively live and a weekly highlights show on the BBC Red Button and AMP BBC Two, which started in November, and live television, radio and online rights to screen the Super Bowl alongside Sky Sports. The London Games were presented by Nat Coombs, Mike Carlson and Osi Amenyora, with Oro Duba as sideline reporter. The new BBC Highlights show is presented by Mark Chapman alongside Osi Amenyora and Jason Bell. Both the live coverage and highlights use coverage and commentators from American TV. The BBC previously held the rights to live coverage, highlights and live radio coverage of the NFL from 2007 to 2013. Jake Humphrey presented the playoff highlights show for the first 2 years, with Matt Roberts taking over duties in 2010. The studio pundits included Mike Carlson, Rod Woodson and Jay Rice. Since 2012, the BBC aired live weekly radio coverage of the NFL on BBC Radio 5 Live Sports Extra, and aired the Super Bowl on BBC TV and BBC Radio 5 Live in 2012, but Jake Humphrey stepped down and was replaced by Mark Chapman. For the 2012-13 season, the BBC broadcast Monday Night Football on the iPlayer and via BBC HD. Channel 4 then took over as the terrestrial home of NFL on British TV, showing a Sunday night game, the 2 London games and the first Super Bowl in 16 years in 2014, after last covering the Super Bowl in 1998. Absolute Radio took over the BBC radio rights. Other sports. As well as all of this, the BBC broadcasts winter sports, including the Alpine Skiing World Cup, under its Ski Sunday banner, and briefly covers sports such as road and track cycling, sailing, badminton, table tennis, squash, equestrianism, gymnastics and other minority sports. Presenters for these sports include Jill Douglas and Phil Jones, who often report for other areas of BBC Sport. BBC Sport regained coverage of the boat race from ITV Sport, who pulled out of coverage after the 2009 event. A 5-year contract was signed by BBC Sport to cover the event from 2010, after last covering the 2004 race. Claire Balding hosts this, and commentary came from Andrew Cotter from 2010, 2011, 2013 present, and from Jonathan Leggett in 2012. The race is also broadcast on BBC World News. Former presenters for this were Harry Carpenter, who also commentated, and Steve Ryder, while Barry Davies also commentated on this from the 1990s to 2004. BBC Sport also holds the rights to the Invictus Games, which is presented by Claire Balding, Adi Adepitan, Jonathan Edwards. The BBC also has rights to highlights of equestrianism from badminton, horse trials and Burghley horse trials. The coverage is hosted by Claire Balding, and if she is unavailable, Rishi Prasad hosts with commentary by Mike Tucker. The BBC also shows the World Indoor Bowls Championships. Currently this is presented by Rishi Prasad with commentary by David Corkle and analysis from current players such as Greg Harlow and Andy Thompson. Former Bowls presenters include David Icke and Dougie Donnelly. Worldwide rights Northwest 200 live of practice qualifying races on BBC Sport Online. The boat races live on BBC World News. Radio sports rights. BBC Sport had monopolised the sports commentary market on British radio since the BBC's conception, but since 2000, has lost coverage of some sporting events to competitors including TalkSport. The majority of BBC Sports radio coverage is broadcast on BBC Radio 5 Live and BBC Radio 5 Live Sports Extra. However, coverage is also broadcast on BBC Radio 4's long-wave frequencies, BBC Local Radio and the BBC World Service. Highlights are also reported on the BBC Radio 1 and BBC Radio 2 news bulletins. Although cricket is not covered on television, the sport is fully covered by the BBC on its radio platforms, primarily BBC Radio 5 Live, 5 Live Sports Extra, but also in local radio and BBC Radio 4 Longwave. This commentary is repeated and expanded on the BBC Sports website and on the BBC Red button, overlaid with live scorecards. While television coverage of the London 2012 Paralympic Games was held by Channel 4, the BBC retained the radio rights to the event and plans to broadcast events on radio stations 5 Live and BBC Radio 5 Live Sports Extra. Previous coverage. Horse racing. Horse racing coverage on the BBC had declined in recent years and finished altogether at the end of 2012 when Channel 4 won the rights to the Grand National, Royal Ascot and the Epsom Derby. The BBC had lost many tracks over the years, such as the Cheltenham Festival and other Cheltenham meetings went to Channel 4 in 1995. Meetings from Newbury moved to Channel 4 in 2002, and after 50 years Glorious Goodwood and other Goodwood meetings were lost to Channel 4 in 2007. Also, in 2007 the Irish Derby, which had been included in Grandstand and later Sunday Grandstand for decades, was only shown on at the races. The Grand National used to be one of the biggest attractions on Grandstand, with audiences around or often in excess of 10 million for the race on a Saturday afternoon. Coverage of other events such as Royal Ascot and the Epsom Derby were also broadcast. The Derby was won back after many years in 2001, when the BBC also gained rights to the Epsom Oaks, which had only ever previously been shown by ITV and Channel 4. The most famous BBC TV racing broadcaster was Peter O'Sullivan, who became one of the first ever TV sports commentators in the immediate post-war years and stayed with the BBC until 1997. Julian Wilson had presented the BBC's horse racing coverage for more than 30 years and also retired in 1997. Claire Balding took over presenting duties following Julian's retirement. Cricket. Prior to 1999, the BBC had shown live cricket coverage for many decades. Coverage had been fronted by Peter West and later by Tony Lewis. Richie Benaud was a commentator for the BBC for more than 30 years. In 1999, the BBC lost coverage of England home matches to Channel 4. One of BBC Sport's major criticisms is that it no longer shows any live cricket games. The BBC was also criticised for subsequently not bidding for the rights to show home test matches. The BBC broadcast highlights of the 2007 ICC Cricket World Cup, 2009 ICC World 2020 and the 2011 ICC Cricket World Cup. These were hosted by Sonali Shah, Rishi Prasad and Manish Bashan. They also had highlights of the 2006-07 Ashes series with Manish Bashan. The BBC take the world feed for these tournaments, which all broadcasters take, including Sky Sports, and this comprises commentators from broadcasters all over the world, examples of which are Nasser Hussain, Michael Atherton and David Lloyd from Sky Sports, as well as Mark Nicholas and Michael Vaughan from Channel 5. Channel 9. Motorsport. The BBC covered the World Rally Championship until 2001, when Channel 4 bought the rights. WRC is now shown on ITV4. The BBC gave up the rights to the British Touring Car Championship at the end of 2001, with the rights eventually being picked up by ITV. Formula 1. The BBC covered Formula 1 from 1978 until 1996 and from 2009 to 2015. The BBC provided live coverage of all races from 2009 to 2011, but from 2012 to 2015 the BBC showed 10 races live each season and highlights of all the races, including the ones shown live. The BBC always showed the British Grand Prix and the final race live. Coverage was presented by Jake Humphrey from 2009 to 2012 and Susie Perry from 2013 to 2015, with David Coulthard, Eddie Jordan and Alan McNish providing analysis during the races. Lee Mackenzie and Tom Clarkson acted as pit lane reporters. The main commentators were Jonathan Leggett in 2009 and 2010, Martin Brundle in 2011 and Ben Edwards from 2012 to 2015. Brundle acted as co-commentator in 2009 and 2010 and David Coulthard from 2011 to 2015. James Allen, Alan McNish and Jack Nichols provide radio coverage with Jenny Gow as pit reporter, though they also appeared on BBC TV. Mackenzie presented Inside F1 for BBC News. Murray Walker continues to contribute to coverage across the BBC as he has done for over 60 years, and triple world champion and Mercedes driver Lewis Hamilton has a blog on BBC's website. On the 21st of December 2015, the BBC announced that they will be terminating the contract to show Formula 1 races from 2016. Channel 4 now show highlights from each race, as well as 10 live, with Sky Sports F1 still showing all races live. However, BBC Radio 5 Live will continue to broadcast races until 2021. Motorcycling: BBC Sport had coverage of the British and World Superbikes for a few years, often showing the World Championship version live. It lost the BSB rights to Premium TV at the end of 2001. Premium TV didn't have a channel of its own, so subleased the rights first to the ITV Sport channel, then British Eurosport. After acquiring the rights to the Motage World Championship in 2003, coverage of the World Superbikes was dropped. In 2003, the BBC won the rights to the Motage World Championship. After a successful first season fronted by Susie Perry, coverage was expanded with more live races and the contract was extended to the end of the 2013 season. The BBC showed all Motage races, with all qualifying sessions live via the BBC Red Button. From the 2009 season, more coverage became available on qualifying and race days again through the use of the Red Button service. Jenny Gow replaced Perry for 2010, but from 2011 former pit lane reporter Matt Roberts became host, alongside the original and unchanged commentary team of Charlie Cox and Steve Parish. Azadi Farney replaced Roberts as pit lane reporter. From 2013, qualifying moved from BBC Red Button to BBC Two. In May 2013, it was announced that the rights to Motage coverage had been awarded to BT Sport, in a 5-year deal starting in 2014. None of the BBC team were recruited by BT Sport for the 2014 season. However, BBC Sport still gives comprehensive coverage of the Irish Road Racing Championship, the International Northwest 200 and the Ulster Grand Prix, together with other road racing meetings within Ireland, together with the Southern 100 motorcycle races on the Isle of Man. These programs are produced by BBC Northern Ireland. Paralympic Games. The BBC had shown limited coverage of the Paralympics since the 1980s, with the amount of coverage increasing in the 2000s to include some live coverage of the 2008 Paralympic Games. The BBC lost the TV rights to the 2012 Paralympic Games to Channel 4 after they made a £10 million bid. The deal was later extended until the 2016 Games. The BBC covered the BDO World Championships from its inception in 1978 until 2016. In February 2016, it was announced that the BBC would cover the inaugural Champions League of Darts, and as a consequence its 38-year association with the British Darts organisation came to an end. The BBC also covered the BDO Women's World Masters from 2001 to 2010, but this coverage was lost to ESPN.